Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the live webinar for Step 2.7 in week 2 of the History of Royal Fashion. We're delighted that you could join us this afternoon. And for those of you that weren't able to make it for time differences or work commitments or anything like that, the link to this video will be live as soon as we can make it available after the broadcast is finished. So don't worry, you're not missing out on anything. So I'm Sally Tuckett and I'm here with Vicky Price, who's a lecturer at University of Glasgow and is an expert in Elizabethan and Jacobean theatre. Today, the purpose of this webinar is really to talk a bit more about some of the themes and the questions that have come up from the previous steps this week. So it's a lot about the performance and the performative style of dress in Jacobean and Caroline masks, the purpose of fancy dress, why people do it, why people like it, why people hate it, all that kind of thing. And we've seen some great questions and comments from you all, and we'll do our best to address as many of them as we can. But I think just to kick us off, first of all, Vicky, could you just remind us what a mask is and why it's important to the Stuart courts?
Sure. So hello everyone. Yeah, absolutely happy to start with some general information about the masks. So the masks were these really elaborate performances. Were very different from the sorts of performances that were happening on your commercial stage. They involved very carefully choreographed dance movements. They involved elaborate kind of music. There was written text that would have been delivered, the lines would have been delivered by professional actors, and often members of the royal family and the nobility also participated in very particular roles in the masks as well. There was a sense of bringing everyone together in these court circles. It was very much about celebrating, for example, in relation to James and Anne of Denmark, very much about celebrating James's power, celebrating the wealth of the nation, displaying the wealth of the nation. So these very elaborate performances, often tied into weddings and births, happening usually as part of Christmas festivities as well.
So there's very much a sense of, it's all about display, it's all about extravagance. My understanding is that it's still actually quite a small, relatively small circle. It's not general public, is it? This is for the royals and their court only.
That's right. It's very much invitation only, both in terms of those. So I mentioned that there would be professional actors who would perform some parts, and other parts might have been performed by members of the court circles, and that latter bit would have absolutely been invitation only, and that extended to the audience as well. That audience would have been a very elite courtly audience. Often these festivities coincided with visits from different, it might be foreign diplomats or ambassadors, who sometimes themselves would be invited to participate as well as to watch these masks.
Oh goodness, okay, so it wasn't just not necessarily like a sort of, I've pictured them in my head as quite sort of cliquey. And it isn't to an extent, but if ambassadors could be like, hello, Ambassador of France, could you join in too? And so political diplomacy.
I think absolutely there's something really interesting about the ending of the mask, because at the ending of the mask, the audience who've been seated up until this point are invited to participate. I mean, these masks that you have, if you look at some of the text that we have from these masks, they look quite short because they're about 10 or 11 pages. But when you actually put it together with all the dancing that happened at the end of the narrative of the mask, as it were, they would go on for several hours. And so there's this kind of, that kind of imagined separation between the audience and the formal mask performers becomes almost dissolved at the end of the mask. So if the foreign ambassadors, for example, are participating in that dancing at the end, there's a sense in which the boundaries become very blurred and they become implicated in the action and the narrative that has taken place before.
And that blurring would actually make sense, because one of the questions that popped up a lot in the comments from the learners was what the difference between the audience and the players and how you could tell the difference. Because we saw in previous videos, sometimes the costumes, especially for the masks around the Caroline period, the silhouette is similar to the fashion of the time. It's just a bit more extravagant. And obviously there are some that are more costumes that are more extreme. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But a lot of people have been asking about how much the audience were involved, which you've answered that because there's this blurring at the end. But also, how much would the audience have understood what was going on? Because you've said there's all these elements. There's the costume, there's the staging, there's the lighting, and we'll talk a bit more about the symbolism of the costume a bit later. But if you are an ambassador to France and you've just arrived at the court, how much would you understand what is going on in the masque?
I think there's a lot of visual motifs that are used and are readily recognisable. There is a lot of drawing on classical mythology that whether you were from England or from further afield, again, because you're presumably part of this elite culture, you will have had that schooling and will be able to decode. I think coming back to the visual side of things, there's so many different layers to that in terms of
costumes as well as everything else.
Yeah, and I think that colours, come into play there. There's so many different visual semiotics, if you like, the different sign systems on the stage that the majority of people would absolutely, if not all, would have been able to decode. And I think that, there's something quite interesting, and we'll maybe come to this a little bit later when we're thinking about maybe some of the gender politics to do with masks, but there's something quite interesting about to what extent the different layers of the semiotics, the different signs, work together, or maybe might be pulling apart slightly and suggesting slightly different readings. But that's maybe something we can unpack when we think about the gender politics of the masks.
I mean, it's that layering is so evident, even just in the examples that we've seen in the previous steps. So the costume of Henrietta Maria, you mentioned colour.
Yes.
So that costume is a lovely blue. I mean, it's a gorgeous blue, and with all the stars and the sunbursts embroidered down from the waist, it's very much representing a celestial kind of appearance. She's representing the universe, really. Absolutely. And the blue is a popular colour, I think, in masque costumes, often against red. Or a shade of red. There's popular lots of references to carnation, which could mean anything from pale pink up to dark red. And that has been linked in some cases to religion. The Virgin Mary is often depicted, obviously, with the blue, but there'll be a snippet of red in there as well. And with Henrietta Maria, that obviously is also quite interesting. Bringing religion into it. We don't have time, but we spend a whole nother extra webinar talking about meanings of religion and symbolism in that. But so I kind of digressed from the audience a bit there. So the audience are they're kind of involved. And now I don't know if this is pertinent in any way, shape, or form, but all of a sudden I'm thinking of pantomimes. The sort of particular take. Is that a fair analogy, or is that completely off the board?
I think it is a fair analogy, actually, because there's various moments throughout a pantomime. I mean, Scottish pantomime in particular is quite elaborate and is maybe a different kind of beast to pantomimes elsewhere in the world. But regardless of what form of pantomime you're used to, I think absolutely that element of audience participation, in-house jokes are very standard within pantomimes. And I'm not sure it was in-house jokes in the masque, but rather it was in-house codes that were absolutely there to be interpreted, read, received by the audience members, and usually codes in relation to the virtues that James, for example, was wanting to promote his nation as being representative of. So that if the audience is becoming implicated in action at the point that they join in with the dancing, there's a sense that they're automatically signing off to those virtues and that they're going to embody them as well. So there's something really clever going on with that audience participation, I think.
Sure. And I think James is very he's a fascinating one, because we've learned how for the first mask that they put on, they plundered Queen Elizabeth's wardrobe, which sounds like that the Stuarts were coming in and just grabbing everything, but actually there was probably something there might be political expediency behind that. I mean, he's just arrived, and so he wants to show that he's got a legitimate right to be there, so he's using the old Queen's things. Pragmatic, it's reusing stuff that's there and available, but also I think the mask was put on quite quickly after he got there. So there's a time issue coming on. You know, these things sound like they would have taken an enormous amount of time to prepare, and you've got to make the most of what you've got available to you.
I wonder if there's another element to that as well in terms of that recycling, in the sense that if he's just come to the throne, it's been a little bit contested in some parts. In terms of that his cousin Arbella Stuart, some members of society believe that she had a stronger claim to the throne, and so there's a sense of him kind of, if he's reusing this particular garment in some ways and recycling it, then it's a sense of, yes, I am firmly a part of this lineage and I'm rightfully occupying this throne. So there's maybe an element of that coming into play as well, which is interesting.
And apparently he also used the colour coding system as well. There was lots of red and lots of white, so red for England and white for Scotland, showing bringing them all together. Another, and you alluded to this a second ago as well, but it came up a lot in some of the comments from the learners, was this gender issue. Which is something that is fascinating on so many levels, because we have this, a lot of what we've talked about in the course and in weeks to come, we'll see how clothing is a way of women making political statements, using it to show their political participation in things. And in the Mask article, it does reference this, like especially Queen Anne of Denmark and Henrietta Maria, is it a chance for them to make a stamp? So could you elaborate a bit on that? Because some learners are just keen to know more about what that actually means.
The mask formed during Anne of Denmark's tenure as Queen Consort is really, really exciting for a number of different reasons. One, the mask form itself really evolves. So, for example, prior to about 1608, 1609, you just had a particular narrative within a mask. And I'll come back to that in a little bit in a moment, and I'll expand on that because I'll give 2 examples. But after 1608, 1609, you get almost 2 parts to a mask. You get what is known as an anti-mask and then the mask proper. And in the anti-mask, it's all about these forces of disorder coming onto the stage. So, for example, the Mask of Queens is a really brilliant example of this. The Mask of Queens, it starts off with some witches who occupy the stage. They're seen to be representing all that is, according to the thinking of the time, undesirable about women. So they talk about how they don't want to be maternal. They talk about that they they want to cause all this mischief throughout the realm, and they sit and they plot about it. So it's tapping into very much the stereotypes that were operative in early modern society about women must be chaste, silent, obedient, or you're going to be located in this other category of the unruly and therefore the unchaste. And then what happens at the end of that sequence, where you have these witches performing these different, quite jagged, very inelegant kind of movements on the stage, there's a thunderclap, and they are banished from the stage, and this house of fame comes from above, descends onto the stage, and 12 goddesses, including Anne of Denmark, was representing and performing part of one of these goddesses, arrive, and they're capturing this lineage of queens that have, are very famous from different parts of history and different parts of mythology, and are seen to very much represent civility, and they've got a very different type of movement that their bodies are enacting throughout the dance sequence that they perform. So it's a sense of kind of banishing that which is threatening the realm, and James kind of facilitating this kind of restoration of order, in this case through Anne of Denmark. So to bring this back, on the surface, this looks like it's adhering to the codes that would be prescribed for women at that time, if you base it on the kind of text and the lines that are delivered. And the lines that are delivered once the female maskers arrived, who weren't allowed to deliver any lines. There's an introducer almost called Perseus who introduces their arrival. And he talks about Anna's character as very much almost a mirror of James's power.
Okay.
And so it's a sense of that she's defined through him. So that's the message that's given based on the text.
Right.
But when you look at some of the images that the women have on, for example, their fans that they were holding, they had different hieroglyphics printed on them. It was things to do with fertility, abundance, the women that they had chosen to assume the characters of were very much women who had a very rich history. These were powerful, active queens who had not been defined through men. So there's a sense of Anna and her ladies in Mask, the queens, going, okay, we do embody the virtues of the court, but we're not going to be defined through the proximity of our relationship to men. We occupy these in our own right, and we have our own agency. So that would be one example. The other would be the Mask of Blackness.
Yes,
which is a really interesting mask. Now, the narrative of that, it's really important to say, is really problematic from a 21st century reading of the mask, in terms of the narrative talks about African princesses being brought to a land called Tanya, so Britain, so tapping into the idea of James, who's very recently occupied the throne, and I suppose part of him seeking to expand his nation, very much tapping into different colonial discourses that were operative at that time. But what's really interesting about that mask is that at the end of the mask, the female maskers who've come onto the masking stage in black makeup, the narrative, the spoken lines demand a transformation. Where the African princesses become whitened, and again, clearly, absolutely unacceptable by today's standards. But what their thinking behind that mask was at that time was that it was celebrating James's ability to transform these women. Now, the reality of what happened, if you add into play the visual semiotics, what happens at the end of the mask is that the women leave the stage still with the black makeup on, and the asked for, the promised transformation has not taken place. So that's one element. And the other element is that they're called back to the sea by the moon goddess, who is this feminine entity. And so it's very much a sense of, again, we are going to define ourselves, we're not going to be defined through James. There's a sense of an undermining of that celebration of James's power and reach, in some sense, in the Mask of Blackness. And it clearly caused quite a scandal at the court as a result of that subtext, if you like, about that James's power wasn't perhaps as strong as he was claiming it to be.
Even his own wife was saying, hang on a second, hold your horses, mate, I'm here as well, and I've got just as much. And that is, so this is around 1604.
So Mask of Blackness is 1605.
1605. So still very early in his reign. And I think from a costume perspective, like you say, there's the problematic issue of them using black makeup. And that's an issue that, again, that could be a whole series of discussions in itself. From the actual clothing, if I remember correctly, Anne was actually sort of criticised, not just for the makeup on her arms, but the fact that she was exposing her arms and parts of her legs.
That's right,
which for mask costumes, and again, this comes up in the video a little bit with the Past Pleasures team, there needs to be a certain amount of movement. You've mentioned the movement, and the women who are not going to be witches, they have a more graceful movement, different style of movement, and that would be affected by the clothing. And when you look at a lot of the designs for mask costumes, there is a fair amount of exposure of the limbs. But people seem to have been quite shocked by this when Anne appears in this.
I mean, it's really interesting when you think about it in the context of that she is the Queen Consort, and there are parts of the body on display. This was not the first time either that there had been comments about her participating masks. The very first mask that she had participated in, masked by Samuel Daniel, the Vision of 12 Goddesses, she performed the part of Pallas, and her legs and ankles were on display, and different courtiers commented about, we never knew that the women of the court had legs and arms before. So I know that there's something quite interesting in terms of that again, I wonder if it's about quite deliberately presenting a sense of female dissidence or opposing female bodies on the stage. And again, that sense of not allowing themselves to be defined by the male, authored code of conduct that was prescribed for them in some sense at that time. I think there's another element as well. If you think about it in terms of the very intricate dance moves that they would have been performing, having a costume a wee bit above does actually enable you to see the specifics of those movements much more evidently. Another strand is that in many ways, a lot of focus goes on the female maskers and their costumes, but there's also a sense that quite often the male maskers' costumes could be viewed through an eroticized lens as well, in that quite often the male limbs were very much on display, but quite often critics give that less attention. So I'm wondering if it's more about a particular desired physique, bodily physique, that's being emphasised as part of that courtly expectation. I don't know.
I think that would play really nicely with the comparison with the Tudors, for example. So Henry, we've learned Henry loved to display his calves. He was very proud of his calves, and I've read somewhere that the Stuart mask, some of the men would just like Tudor and later, they would pad their stockings to give their calves a more muscular look. Which I think is fascinating, and that feeds into exactly what you're saying. Like there's this, sometimes it becomes all about the women and what the women are doing and what they're exposing, but actually the men were probably paying just as much attention. And so there's that nice link with the Tudor emphasis on the calf and the masculinity of a strong leg. And then by the time you get to the Caroline court, so with King Charles, high heels start to become more fashionable, and men are wearing the high heels in the mask as well. And that, just like women wearing heels today, elongates the leg, it draws attention to it. You're getting slightly higher waistlines, and it's all emphasizing a lithe body, basically. And you're supposed to look graceful and delicate. And all these parts coming together.
And the other thing it's maybe worth touching on is the display of breasts in the costumes, which I know that we had some comments about as well. And I'm thinking about this in terms of the lighting in the room, in terms of very much via candlelight and a flickering light, and how much there's lots of debates about this, isn't there, as to whether the actual breasts themselves were on display or whether it was prosthetic breasts that would be used, again tapping into the idea of a particular desirable physique and so on. So the flimsiness of the costume in some sense, whether or not anything could be seen through it in this flickering light is I suppose one element. And then the second element is that where they were, for example, wearing flesh-coloured material over their breasts. So I'm not necessarily convinced that it was always the breasts themselves that were fully revealed, that there was another couple of layers going along there in terms of to protect that these are courtly elite women.
And it'd be interesting to know actually what the learners think about that debate, because I think one of those images on the Stuart Mask article had the breasts exposed in one of Inigo Jones' drawings, and it is an interesting debate, because in some of his designs there are loads of examples out there. If anybody's interested, you can just do a quick Google and find some more of Inigo Jones' designs out there. Loads of them do have the bare breasts, but sometimes you can see just sort of what could be like a line of material, so it could represent that it's just a flesh-coloured fabric, or like you say, some sort of early modern prosthetic. And the arguments is quite, the argument for the fact that these women are exposing themselves in this way could be related to the fact that these are essentially private gatherings. I mean, it's a lot of people, but it's a closed court, so it might not matter so much on some levels. On the other hand, it's still a lot of people.
Yeah.
And there is still, I think we do forget that historic societies have different ideas about what's proper and what's not, but still, it would seem unusual for multiple women to be walking around topless. That would be my take on it, but I don't know what the learners think about this, if they've come across any of this in their own investigations, because it'd be a fascinating thing to talk more about. Like the lack of costume can mean just as much as the presence of costume.
Absolutely.
But that, I mean, moving on to the costumes themselves, that's like a nice little segue into that. We've had a lot of questions about the costumes. We've talked a little bit about how sometimes they might cause a bit of controversy, where they got them from. But it's the where people got them from and the making of them that people are being fascinated by. And I don't know if you've come across much of this in your own research, but the making of them, the example we've used in one of the videos is Inigo Jones and Tempe Restored in 1632. And Inigo Jones was obviously a key figure in masks, who seems to have had a hand in pretty much everything. You get the sense he was a bit of a micromanager.
Yeah.
And then when it comes to costumes, there's this debate over the design. So I don't know if you would know that from your perspective, having researched the women, because the design for the dress that is in the video with Henrietta Maria's costume with the blue dress and the silver stars embroidered on everything, there is actually a surviving design by Inigo Jones.
Yeah.
But it's got a little flap on the front of it, so it's two versions. And so you can lift the top half up, and there's a different design underneath, which gives the sense that Inigo Jones was perhaps in correspondence with the Queen.
Yes.
To say, what do you want to wear, madam? Would you like to wear this?
Yeah.
I've got two options for you. This one's very nice. This one's also very nice. You know, do you think there was that kind of relationship with it, or do you think he was actually kind of, I've got a vision, and everybody must fit this vision?
Yeah, I think he did very much have a vision, but I also think that particularly Anna of Denmark was very involved in the commissioning of the masks, had her own sense of what they should look like. And we know this from Johnson, actually, who was obviously commissioned for Mask of Blackness to write the text. In the printed version, there are a number of almost disclaimers where he talks about it was Her Majesty's will to have it this way.
Excellent.
So I suspect if she's doing that with Johnson, she's also very much doing that with Inigo Jones as well.
And again, it goes back to that female agency that you were talking about with Anna of Denmark. Like, you really do get a sense more of their personality coming from. I want it like this.
Yeah.
I know what I want, and I want it like this.
Yeah.
And it does make you wonder about. There's been a lot of questions actually, and this is something that I'm always keen to know as well, is like how they get from that stage of that design to the final thing. Do you know roughly how long does it take to put a mask together? Because we're focusing on the costume, that's just one element, but if you're talking about this whole thing, how long do they take to say, I want to have a mask? How much prep time do you need? Is it like a royal wedding today and it takes 6 months planning, or is it quicker than that? Because there's been some debate about this.
Sure. I don't know much about that element of it, but what I do know is that certainly the rehearsal period was very, very short. It would be a matter of 3-4 weeks usually.
Okay.
So it was almost like these teams who were working on different elements of the mask and presumably had to communicate with one another. But the point at which all the performers are brought together, it's a really tight window of time.
That's very short.
The other thing I know is that there's a lot of debate around, in terms of the making of the costumes. I'm sure you know a lot about this, more than me in this, but my sense is that there's a lot of debate about whether or not they were made up of costume elements recycled from, for example, commercial theatres. My personal view on that is no, because there's, from the archive evidence that we do have, it's clear that they are buying in particular fabrics that are a little bit different from what's happening on the commercial stage. And the wealth of things that they're buying in does not suggest that they're recycling other materials. So presumably they're having to hire a whole range of people in the lead up to this. Haberdashers, people to work on the items of footwear, a range of different people to work on that aspect of it. So that hopefully answers one. And I saw a couple of questions about would these have been kind of bought in, and I think the materials would have been bought in, and then they would have been constructed specifically for the purpose of these masks.
Like you say, there's a massive team of people involved in this, and you will have noticed from our discussion of Stuart fashion in general, one of the arguments for mask costumes is that they're made of composite elements. Like you rarely get a complete outfit that's made of all one piece of material, but you get stockings, you get shoes, you get skirts, you get, if men get doublets, there's or jackets, there's different elements of it which require different skills for making. So like you say, you've got to buy in the silk to make it. You've then got to get a decent tailor to make it properly. You might have somebody else doing the embellishments and putting the embroidered decoration on it. You'll have somebody else making any ruffs or collars or headpieces, or like a whole team of people would have been involved. It's interesting you say it's 3 to 4 weeks for rehearsals. It makes you think about the lead. I don't know anything about this world at all, but the lead-in time for modern theatre productions, and you always have the dress rehearsal very close to the first performance, as far as I'm aware. And there is one story of 2 young boys, and I think it was for one of the Charles I masks, I think, who only got their outfits the night before the mask itself. So I think there's also references to rehearsals being done in mock-ups of the costumes. So costumes made of pieces of calico or cheaper material, because obviously you don't want to ruin it before the night itself. So there's lots of different elements. You'd have to make the mock-up first, make sure that fits, then you make the real thing, hope that that fits in time for the real event. Lots of different pieces, but I think I agree with you. I don't think they would have been using other people's costumes, especially for the king and queen. You cannot imagine you going up to Henrietta Maria and saying, this one's just come from the London stage, what do you think? That I don't think that would work at all. But with the composite nature, you can see them reusing things, recycling things. Repurposing is perhaps a better word rather than recycling. Repurposing something and maybe changing the embellishment or cutting it into a different shape and doing it that way. But the records are very scant when it comes to that kind of information. It's it boggles the mind to think how many people must have been involved, from Inigo sketching it out to his big idea to actually the realisation of it, to Henrietta Maria coming down onto the stage. Wearing it.
So many different voices struggling to kind of coexist and have their say in what this looks like. Because I've read somewhere that, for example, you were talking about the kind of mock-ups of some of the garments, and I believe that sometimes they would offer, they would kind of make up several different versions of the same costume in different colours, presumably with the sense to see which, for example, female courtier might look best and what is most flattering to the individual courtier. So I think that's quite interesting as well. It does sound as if those sorts of very particular decisions were made so close to the mask taking place itself.
And presumably there's got to be a bit of dialogue as to what part that person plays. Anyway, I mean, we've talked a little bit about symbolism, but that's going to have a massive bearing on what they're actually wearing. If it's the key, again, like theatre today, the key characters are going to have more investment in their costume than, is it the anti-mask, as you said? The crowd scenes.
The anti-maskers costumes are quite interesting in that they would have been worn quite often by the king's men, formerly Shakespeare's theatre company, and often there was slightly less expensive materials used for the costumes that the anti-maskers would have worn. presumably partly to economise,
Yes.
given the kind of crazy amounts of money that was spent on these entertainments, but also presumably to kind of reinstill that sense of hierarchy that yes, these professional actors were occupying the same stage as the courtiers, but there's still a sense of that, you know, what your social standing is, and perhaps using that to kind of reinforce.
Yeah, just like it would have done in the general court setting, not even the mask, you would have been able to know straight away from somebody's the cost, the quality of somebody's outfit.
Yeah.
Well, the idea was you should have known what somebody's status was from the quality of their outfit. But you mentioned expense there, and that's something that comes up a lot as well. A lot of comments have been about how much this was all costing.
Yeah.
Because your article mentions that it was, I think, roughly, or estimates, because again, the records are scanty, we don't necessarily have the same amount of information for every single mask, but a conservative estimate would be that they cost around £2,000 to put something on like this, which would make sense when you've got all these processes that we've talked about and all these people. What was raised in the comments was how much would this be in today's money? Do you know how much this would be?
I don't.
Okay, according to my calculations, which should come with a little asterisk, so somebody please check. That is about, so £2,000 per mask, is about £240,000 in today's money for a one-off event. So these are costumes that are going to be worn once, possibly reused again, but you'll never see that iteration again.
Yeah.
You might see bits of it, but you'll never see the whole thing. And just to put that in a bit of perspective for the time, apparently similar amounts were spent on New Year's gifts.
Okay.
So we've talked, this came up a little bit in the Tudor week, the idea of gifting things, and New Year was a traditional time to give gifts. And so similar amounts seem to have been spent for that. So that makes it, I mean, it's still a ridiculous amount of money, but it puts it a bit more in perspective.
Yeah.
At the other end of the scale, if you wanted to, with that £2,000, you could buy 300 horses. So that's good to know.
Yeah.
And if you want, there's some more examples of this. Like I say, the records are a bit patchy for each one. I went down such a rabbit hole looking at these things the other day. We know that for one of the masks with Charles I in 1634, he spent just over £121 in the currency of 1634. Do you want to have a guess at what that would be worth today? £121 for one outfit.
I wouldn't even, I don't know. What did it amount to?
Apparently, £14,700.
Oh my gosh.
And this is also, this is through our currency converter thing. You can get, I'll put the link up for the learners later so you can play around with yourself because it's a fascinating thing. So it does vary year on year. But again, to put that into a little bit of context, that same amount, £121, was apparently roughly the annual wage for one of Henrietta Maria's musicians. So that's somebody's entire salary for a relatively educated, presumably educated, well-off person.
Yeah.
And at the other end of the scale, a maid's annual wage was roughly £1 a year. So you can see why maybe some people thought that these were a bit of an extravagant success.
Absolutely. Yeah. But I mean, if we look at, for example, very timely, the wedding happening this weekend.
Yeah.
I'd love to know what the expenses are spent on that and the outfits. And there's an interesting thing about that in the sense that if the dress, for example, is not amazing, we'll all be like feeling a little bit disappointed. So on the one hand, we can critique the amount of money being spent, but also because quite often these masks were tied into births and weddings, these are really important events for the nation at that time.
I just always think it's interesting. You've got this double-edged sword because these masks are actually moralising. They're supposed to, they're, like you say, they're talking about how good James is or how brilliant Charles is, and there's always a moral to them, and yet they're spending all this money. You can see why the church in particular was a bit like, hang on, this is maybe not going the right way. So that's, and related to the cost, another question that popped up a lot was who was paying for all of this?
Yeah.
Which, and the masks in general, I mean, is
my assumption until 2 days ago was that it would be the Revels office, because for the commercial theatres it was the Revels office that very much paid for it.
And so what is the Revels office?
So the Revels office basically headed up all the arts entertainments for the court, and also was in charge of kind of licensing play scripts and licensing the playhouses as well. But there's a shift in the role of the Revels office around 1580. And in 1580s, I believe that the budget centre from which the costs affiliated with the Masque has transitioned, so that it was no longer coming out of the Revels office budget and was coming out from one of the other budgets within the Crown.
So it was the Crown
budget.
Yes, that would make sense.
But slightly separate to the budget that the Crown had given to the Revels office.
Yeah.
So it's absolutely the Crown paying for all of this. But the budget code was a little bit different to what everyone
else terminology.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of, I think there's a bit of a shift, like you say, because I didn't know about the Revels office thing, but I do know that in some of the early ones, in the Jacobean ones, there does seem to be a sense that some of the participants in the Masque might have to pay for the costumes themselves.
Yeah.
Not necessarily for the whole performance, but you're getting to wear this elaborate outfit.
Yeah.
You pay for it basically. And there's an interesting argument that again, if this is something you're interested in, you can just Google Masque portraits, and a lot of them will pop up because there are a lot from the Jacobean era of people who are presumably in Masque outfits. They've got the slightly shorter hemline, they've got some elements of exoticism in there, there's always some kind of big fancy headdress. And the argument goes that because they paid all this money for an outfit that was only going to be worn once, they then wanted that preserved for posterity.
Yes.
They pay even more money and get a portrait painted of it. And so I think that's it just seems a bit unfair. Like, we were inviting you to this party, but you pay for your outfit.
Yeah.
But then I think it does shift later, and the Crown does pay for more of these things. Not necessarily always on time. Apparently there's a significant delay often in the bills being paid, but nothing changes much really there, I suppose. So I think I hope that's covered a lot of your questions when it comes to Masque itself. If you do have more, then put them on the comments and we'll try and go back and have a look at these. But I did also want to talk today a little bit about fancy dress in general. And I probably should add a caveat here that fancy dress in Britain means dressing up in a costume, often with a theme. And from the comments, I've become aware that in America, I believe, and possibly elsewhere, fancy dress means more dressing up smartly for a particular event or occasion. I'm interested in both, so I don't worry if you feel like you've commented on the wrong side. But in terms of British fancy dress, like getting dressed up in a costume, kind of like the Masque, you're adopting a persona, you're perhaps playing a character. The events would be Halloween or something like that. Costume parties of that kind of nature. We asked the learners to talk about why people like to do it and why they might not like to do it. And you and I had a brief chat about this before, but what are your thoughts on it? What are your thoughts on either dressing up today, or if you were in the Stuart court, would you feel happy being involved in this kind of masque, this kind of appearance?
I imagine that if I was in the Stuart court, I would have loved it, because I imagine the days were quite long and the evenings were quite long, and I would immerse it in that sense of entertainment, that element.
It was definitely a lived experience, wasn't it? Like,
Yeah.
taken up a lot,
And I believe there was lots of consumption of alcohol, so maybe that makes it a little bit easier, I don't know. But not that I'm promoting that. In terms of, for me personally, I'm not a fan of fancy dress. And what I mean by that is I'm not a fan of me doing fancy dress. I love looking at other people and what they're wearing, and I'm really kind of always super impressed, particularly people who have made their own costumes.
Yes.
So I'm kind of like, wow, that must be such an achievement once you've created this. It must be really enjoyable to design that. But I myself, I don't know what it's like. I prefer the idea of a masquerade where perhaps you're disguised a little bit more, because sometimes when you're in costume, people still know exactly who it is, and maybe it's a little bit more freeing if you've got that additional kind of layer that helps to disguise you a little bit more.
And the identity thing, just to take it back to the Stuarts and the masks.
Yeah.
How easy was it, do you think, to recognise King? To hear all these stories of Henry VIII, and he would try to disguise himself, but people we still kind of knew. And when you think about the level of social hierarchy in cloth and clothing in general, do you think there is a sense that the King was, in some cases, if there was a masquerade element to it rather than just a costume perspective, was the King trying to blend in some cases, or you know?
The honest answer to that is I don't know. I suspect it varies, because I've read different sorts of accounts of him dressing up and, for example, surprising his new bride and things like that. So there's certainly a kind of sense of a mischievous element and wanting to kind of always play jokes at different times. But I would imagine how freeing must that be if you could kind of just blend in and people couldn't recognise you. I don't know. I kind of agree with you. I'm the same. The whole fancy dress process I find really, I like the finished product. Yeah.
I'm not a creative person, so coming up with an idea is always the first struggle. And I love seeing what other people wear and the reasons behind it. And I think there's always some interesting choices. But one of the things that came up with the learners a lot was this: if you are in fancy dress or in a costume, you can take on a different persona, and if you can be somebody else, it's escapism, it's a bit of fantasy. It can be a really, like you say, freeing experience if you're not a self-conscious person and you just feel like you're standing out like a sore thumb.
And I guess it's that sense of that it's for a particular period of time. It's somehow okay. So I mean, thinking again of some of the behaviour that we know that the courtiers did, and I read a lot of comments from learners talking about, gosh, was this really okay for them to behave like this? And I guess there is a sense that, I'm wondering if masks and fancy dress almost operate as a kind of safety valve, where you know that it's for this particular period of time, it's going to come to an end, so it's okay to kind of experience this sense of licence, because you know that once that period of time is passed, everything returns to normal.
And there's lots of examples, I think, that were coming in. So the carnival, and then in Venice, the masquerade in Venice, and it's like the inversion of the social hierarchy can, and in Halloween you get that too, like trick or treating.
Yes,
there's that element of if you're disguised as somebody, you can get away with a lot more. I think it's a fascinating thing, and I think some of the learners came up with some really good examples of what the equivalent of a mask might be today. Like, what do you think could be the best? What would be the equivalent of a mask when you've got this all-encompassing music, performance, costume, audience participation? I'm thinking pantomime again, but I should move away from that.
But I read online a couple of suggestions that people had about music concerts and gigs, and I think that was a really great kind of example and really immersive example. A sense of community, everybody coming together, experiencing this together. I thought that was a really lovely example. The other one that kind of jumped out at me was the Olympics opening.
That was I thought that was a really good analogy to make. Because in my head, the Olympic ceremonies are always just a little bit bonkers. And I think the masks might have had, maybe not to 17th century sensibilities, but looking back from a modern perspective, they seem a bit bonkers. And it's excess, it's extravagant, it's people pretending to be something that they're not. All the costumes are going to. I think the Olympic, that was a really good example. The only difference being the Olympics are open to everybody, and the masks were closed. Well, not open. Everybody could watch the Olympics. Not everybody could see the masks.
And the other example I had seen that's well known and suggested was the idea of garden parties and kind of Buckingham Palace which actually invites something like that, and the dressing up, so slightly different to the kind of wearing a costume, but the idea of dressing upness. And I wonder if that's not dissimilar to what it might have been like for those who were not acting and performing in the mask, but were an audience member and who were also kind of on display and had to dress up to honour the occasion and mark the occasion.
again, I think there are some great examples of people taking that to the extreme for the audience side, even though they're not in it. I think it was First Earl of Leicester spent a fortune on just being an attendee at the masques, and his household chamberlain is constantly complaining about the amount of money he's spending on it. He actually hires diamonds for one of his outfits to just watch the masque, and ends up losing 2 of them.
Oh.
So there's a very cross note saying we've got to pay for the 2 that you've lost, but we're sending the others back. So like a temporary conspicuous consumption, just hiring this huge wealth just to wear for one night, and then so the royal garden parties I think would be a really good, interesting thing. Weddings as well, just is something that people invest a lot of time and money often into getting the right outfit for that. It's all so many examples. I think I now just can't stop thinking about the Olympics.
Weddings is a really good one, actually, because just thinking about the codes of the wedding in terms of bride and bridesmaids, and the bridesmaids not eclipsing the brides.
Yes.
So there's all sorts of interesting layers.
And if you've got the Queen coming down and embodying the celestial system, you just want a little couple of stars. You don't want any other solar systems. No. Yeah. Well, that's brilliant. Okay, I think that's about all time we have for this afternoon. I really hope you guys have enjoyed it. Thank you so much for sending in so many questions and comments and thoughts, and generally just engaging with this discussion. Like I say, I'm sorry if we couldn't cover your specific questions or comments. We will try and go back and address them more if you've got any more just in the comment section. This link will go live as soon as we can make it available. So if you are watching it live and want to watch back, it should be there very soon. But keep the comments and questions coming. We really enjoying seeing how much you're engaging with the course. It's absolutely fantastic. I should just say a quick thank you. You can't see him because he's slightly off screen, but Jonathan, the mentor, one of the mentors on the course, is here today. So thank you for all your help this afternoon. Keep the questions and comments coming in, and we look forward to seeing what you're going to make of the Georgians in week 3. So thank you very much, and thank you to Vicky. Bye.